am Natalie, 34 years old. And for 5 years, I played the role of a financially dependent housewife. To absolute perfection. My husband and his mother thought I was just a naive, struggling home decor blogger, living entirely off his corporate paycheck. They had absolutely no idea I was quietly running a multi-million-dollar real estate empire right under their noses. Last Tuesday, that carefully crafted illusion shattered. My assistant called me, her voice shaking, to say my mother-in-law had just forced her way into my private downtown office. Through the hidden security cameras, I watched her photograph a highly confidential $12 million acquisition contract. She smiled at the camera, thinking she had finally found proof to destroy me. Instead, she had just handed me the shovel to bury their entire family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic in-laws who underestimated your worth. I was standing in line at a busy downtown coffee shop when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Riley, my fiercely loyal executive assistant at Aura Staging and Acquisitions. When I answered the call, her words came out in a panicked rush. She told me my mother-in-law had just pushed past her at the reception desk. Beatrice had claimed she desperately needed to use the restroom, but instead she marched straight down the hallway and slipped into the restricted corporate records room. Riley had tried to stop her, reminding her the area was completely off-limits to guests. But Beatrice simply ignored her and locked the heavy door from the inside. I stepped out of the noisy coffee shop line and leaned against the cold brick wall outside. I kept my voice incredibly calm and instructed Riley to pull up the security camera feed and send it directly to my phone. Within seconds, the high-definition, black and white video appeared on my screen. The sight made my blood run cold, followed quickly by a wave of sharp clarity. There was Beatrice, my 60-year-old mother-in-law, standing right in the center of my confidential archives. She wore her expensive silk blouse and that signature pearl necklace she always flaunted at our family dinners. To remind me of her wealth, she was methodically sliding open the heavy steel drawers of my secure filing cabinets. Her eyes darted back and forth eagerly as her manicured fingers flipped through manila folders with practiced speed. Beatrice had always despised my working-class background. She believed her son Spencer, an arrogant tech executive, had settled for a poor girl who brought absolutely nothing to the family table. She had spent our entire marriage hunting for any excuse to humiliate me, and Spencer always allowed it. Through the glowing screen of my phone, I watched her pull a thick red folder from the very back of the bottom drawer. It was the Lexington file, our most crucial ongoing deal. I watched her read the front page. A smug, victorious smile spread across her wrinkled face. She quickly pulled her smartphone from her designer leather handbag. The camera flash went off once, twice, 3 times, as she photographed the highly sensitive corporate documents inside. Riley whispered frantically through the phone, asking if she should call the building security guards to have Beatrice forcefully escorted out. I did not hesitate. I told Riley no. I ordered her to return to her desk and let Beatrice walk right out the front door unbothered. I told her not to say a single word or show any sign of panic. When the woman left, Riley was thoroughly confused, but I knew exactly what I was doing. The document Beatrice just photographed was an original corporate purchase agreement. It clearly showed my legal signature, authorizing a massive $12 million corporate transaction. Beatrice did not have the business intelligence to understand corporate holding structures or private equity, she would look at those massive numbers and immediately assume I was either laundering money or somehow embezzling funds directly from her precious son. I hung up the phone and slipped it into my coat pocket. My heart hammered against my ribs, but a cold, calculating peace settled over my mind. For years I had endured their relentless insults. I had let Spencer control my fake household allowance, let him mock my blog, and let Beatrice treat me like a servant at every holiday gathering. I did it because maintaining my cover allowed me to build my wealth in complete peace. But now Beatrice had crossed a dangerous legal line. She thought she had found the ultimate weapon to force me out of her son's life. Empty-handed, she thought she was the predator, closing in for the kill. As I turned and walked back toward my car, I smiled to myself. They were about to learn that the quiet woman they treated like a burden was actually the one pulling all the strings. The war had officially started. Spencer stared at his mother, then down at the illuminated screen, and finally across the table at me. The greed in his eyes was instant and sickening. The idea that his wife, the woman he treated like a financial parasite, was associated with $12 million, completely short-circuited his brain. He did not care about the accusation of fraud or the threats of federal prison. He only cared about the money. Spencer slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. He told me I was out of my mind if I thought I could hide millions of dollars from my own husband. He declared that since we were legally married, whatever dirty operation I was running rightfully belonged to him. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumbs tapping aggressively against the screen. Right there at the dinner table, he logged into our joint banking app. He smugly announced he was instantly revoking my access to our shared checking and savings accounts. He transferred every single dollar of the measly $4,000 we had in joint funds into his private individual account. He leaned across the table, pointing his index finger inches from my face. He told me I was completely cut off. No grocery money, no gas money, no credit cards. He echoed his mother's threat, demanding I have the legal paperwork drawn up by Friday to transfer 80% of Aura staging to his name. If I refused, he would not just let his mother go to the FBI. He would personally drag me into court and take everything I had ever built. I sat perfectly still. I did not blink or show a single ounce of fear. I simply picked up my cloth napkin, wiped the corners of my mouth, and stood up from the table. I told them I was going to bed. Let them think they had won the night. They had just given me the exact motivation I needed to destroy them both. The next morning, Spencer was practically vibrating with arrogance. When I walked downstairs, he was already dressed in his tailored suit, jingling the keys to my SUV. He told me I was taking the public bus to my little rented desk. Today he laughed cruelly, saying a corporate criminal should get used to riding with the commoners. He pulled out of the driveway, leaving me standing on the front porch in the crisp morning air. I waited exactly 2 minutes, until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Then I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to my assistant Riley. 10 minutes later, a sleek black-tinted Mercedes sedan glided smoothly to a stop at the curb. The rear door popped open. I slid into the plush leather seat, greeted by Riley, who handed me a fresh espresso and a sealed iPad. As the driver pulled away, completely bypassing the public bus stop, I opened my secure email server. I initiated a video call with my private wealth management team in Zurich. I instructed them to immediately freeze all blind trusts associated with my name and lock down the corporate holding structures. I ensured that on paper, my personal name was completely untraceable to the liquid assets. Spencer thought he had cut me off by taking $4,000 from a joint checking account. He had no idea. He was playing in a puddle, while I owned the entire ocean. By Thursday evening, Beatrice had successfully deployed her flying monkeys. My phone was blowing up with passive-aggressive texts from Spencer's extended family. Beatrice had called every aunt, uncle and cousin to whisper that I was under federal investigation for financial crimes, and that poor Spencer was trying to save our marriage. This all culminated at the family weekend barbecue, hosted at Spencer's sister's house. Spencer forced me to attend, likely to parade his dominance. When we arrived in the backyard, the whispers stopped immediately. People stared at me like I was a disease. Spencer abandoned me by the drinks cooler, joining his uncles with a smug grin, playing the role of the stressed but honorable husband. Beatrice sat on the patio furniture holding court, shooting me triumphant glares over her iced tea. I was arranging sodas in the ice when Jamal, Spencer's brother-in-law, quietly stepped up beside me. Jamal was a brilliant forensic accountant who had always been treated with subtle condescension by Beatrice and Spencer. He handed me a bottle of water and kept his voice low, his eyes fixed on the grill ahead. Jamal told me I needed to be careful. He revealed that Spencer had pulled him aside earlier that week to ask highly specific questions about the legal loopholes for seizing a spouse's business assets in a divorce, but Jamal added something else. He said Spencer was desperate. The kinds of questions Spencer was asking were not just greedy. They were the frantic questions of a man who was secretly drowning in massive, unpayable debt. Jamal's words hung in the warm air of the backyard barbecue. Massive unpayable debt. Suddenly, every bizarre and aggressive action Spencer had taken over the past week made perfect, terrifying sense. It explained his absolute desperation. At the dinner table, just a few nights prior, hearing Jamal reveal the truth made my mind flash back to that hostile dinner, right before Spencer had frozen our joint bank accounts. Spencer had slammed his fist on the mahogany table and demanded the keys to my leased SUV. He had claimed he needed to look successful for his upcoming promotion, treating me like a financial burden who did not deserve a reliable vehicle. He had wanted me to break down. He had wanted tears and pleading. Instead, I had calmly reached into my purse and dropped the electronic key FOB right into his open palm. I had handed over the keys with a polite smile, secretly knowing that, parked securely inside the private, climate-controlled garage of my downtown headquarters, were 3 company-owned Porsches. I did not need his leased vehicle. I had an entire fleet of luxury cars purchased in cash. My absolute lack of tears that night had infuriated my mother-in-law. Annoyed by my calm demeanor, Beatrice had decided to drop her ultimate bomb right then and there. She had aggressively slid her smartphone across the dinner table, displaying the photograph she had stolen from my secure archives. The $12 million corporate acquisition contract. She had pointed a trembling finger at me, accusing me of running a fraudulent shell company and laundering Spencer's hard-earned money. She was so blinded by her own arrogance that she could not comprehend a woman building an empire independently, now standing by the drinks cooler with Jamal. I realized their aggression was not just about control. It was about survival. Spencer was drowning in a financial hole of his own making, and my supposed shell company was his life raft. Jamal gave me a knowing nod and quietly slipped away to join his wife, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I did not have much time to reflect before Beatrice marched over to the cooler. She stood entirely too close to me, the smell of her heavy floral perfume suffocating. She held up her phone again. The screen, brightly displaying that same stolen contract. She kept her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper, so the other barbecue guests would not hear. She told me my time was running out. She stated that, if I did not have the legal paperwork drawn up by Monday morning to transfer 80% of my company to Spencer, she would march straight into the local FBI field office and report me for corporate fraud. I simply looked at her, offering a blank, unbothered expression. I told her she should do whatever she felt was right for her family. My utter indifference made a thick vein pulse visibly in her forehead. She spun around and stormed off to find Spencer. 2 hours later, the barbecue wrapped up. Spencer told me he had to run a mandatory errand and explicitly instructed me to catch a ride share back to our suburban house. I complied, playing the role of the obedient, defeated wife. But when my ride pulled up to our driveway, an hour later, I was greeted by a humiliating sight. Lined up perfectly, on the front porch were 4 black plastic garbage bags. Inside them were all of my clothes, my shoes and my cheap drugstore makeup. I walked up the concrete steps and tried to turn the heavy brass doorknob. It was locked tight. I checked my phone and found a new text message from Spencer. It was brief and dripping with cruelty. He informed me that he had just changed all the locks on the house. He said that since I was a criminal stealing from him, I no longer had the right to sleep under his roof. He told me I could sleep in a downtown homeless shelter until I was ready to sign over the equity of my company to him. He truly believed he was breaking my spirit. He thought leaving me on the porch in the approaching evening chill would force me to completely surrender. I stood on the porch looking at the black garbage bags. I did not shed a single tear. I pulled out my phone and typed a frantic, desperate-sounding message, begging him to let me inside, pleading that I had nowhere else to go. I hit send, knowing it would perfectly feed his massive ego. Then, I opened a separate secure application and messaged my assistant Riley. I told her to send the company car back to my location. It was time for me to head to the $8 million penthouse my holding company owned downtown. Spencer wanted to play dirty, but he had no idea. He was stepping into a graveyard I had already dug for him. I stepped into the private elevator and swiped my encrypted access card. The heavy metal doors opened directly into the sprawling $8 million penthouse my holding company, reserved for visiting corporate executives. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the glittering downtown skyline. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, poured myself a glass of vintage champagne, and sank into the plush velvet sofa. My phone buzzed aggressively on the glass coffee table. It was another text message from Spencer, mocking me, asking how the local shelter smelled, and if I had made any new friends on the street. I took a slow sip of my champagne, picked up my phone and typed back a pathetic response. I told him I was freezing, crying, and begged him to at least let me come back to the house to get my warm coats. I hit send and smiled. I needed him to feel like an absolute god over the weekend, so his inevitable fall would shatter him completely. By Tuesday morning, Spencer made his next aggressive move. I was sitting at the tiny, cramped desk I rented in a cheap, downtown co-working space. This was the official address I used for my fake home decor blog. What Spencer and his mother did not know was that my corporation actually owned the entire 10-story commercial building. A man in a cheap suit walked up to my desk and dropped a thick manila envelope right on my keyboard. He loudly announced that I had been served and quickly turned away. I opened the envelope It was an emergency filing for divorce and a petition for immediate asset division. Spencer had hired one of the most predatory, expensive family law attorneys in the entire city. The legal documents claimed that, because I had allegedly started my business while using the internet connection at our marital home and surviving on his financial allowance, every single asset of Aura Staging was legally marital property. He was demanding an immediate payout of $6 million, exactly half of the stolen contract valuation. The first mandatory mediation session was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at his lawyer's sleek glass-walled downtown office. I walked in wearing a simple, unassuming beige dress, perfectly playing the part of the terrified, cornered wife. Spencer was already sitting at the massive conference table, wearing a custom-tailored suit and a smirk that could rival a movie villain. Sitting right next to him, which was entirely inappropriate for a legal mediation, was Beatrice. She clutched her designer handbag, glaring at me like I was something she had scraped off her shoe. Before I even pulled out my chair, Spencer's lawyer, a slick man reeking of expensive cologne, tossed a legal pad onto the table. He did not bother with any professional pleasantries. He stated that his client was willing to be extremely generous. He said that if I signed over $6 million today, they would graciously agree not to involve the federal authorities regarding my supposed corporate fraud. It was blatant extortion, disguised as a legal settlement. I looked down at my hands, forcing my voice to tremble. I told them Aura Staging was my entire life's work. I pleaded that taking half the company would bankrupt the entire operation. Beatrice scoffed loudly, slapping her hand flat on the glass table. She called me a manipulative little thief. She announced to the mediator that I had used her son's hard-earned paycheck to fund a fraudulent empire behind their backs. She demanded the court immediately seize all my personal bank accounts to repay the severe emotional distress I had caused her family. The mediator looked visibly annoyed by her outburst, firmly reminding Beatrice she was not a legal party to this divorce. But Spencer quickly defended his mother, claiming she was a key witness to my financial crimes and had every right to be there. Spencer leaned back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head. He told me I had absolutely no way out. He bragged that he had endless funds for this legal battle. He proudly revealed he had just taken out a $400,000 second mortgage on our suburban house to pay his massive legal retainer and destroy me in court. He laughed, mocking me for being homeless, while he was pulling hundreds of thousands in cash from the bank. I kept my head bowed, hiding the sharp, genuine smile forming on my lips. Spencer was so blinded by his own greed that he had just confessed to taking out a massive loan against a house he could not afford. He thought he was intimidating me. He had absolutely no idea that my holding company had recently purchased the regional debt portfolio of the very bank he did not just borrow $400,000. He borrowed it directly from me. I sat quietly in my chair, keeping my eyes fixed on the polished glass table. Spencer and his lawyer continued their aggressive tirade, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the title to Spencer's massive new debt. Spencer's lawyer aggressively tapped his expensive pen against his legal pad. He demanded an immediate settlement, claiming that dragging this through a lengthy court process would only expose my supposed financial crimes to the public. The mediator raised his hand, signaling for silence. He looked exhausted by Beatrice's constant interruptions and Spencer's arrogant demands. The mediator stated that because there were serious allegations of hidden corporate funds and fraudulent shell companies. The standard settlement was no longer possible today. Instead, he announced that a full, independent forensic audit of both parties was legally mandatory before any assets could be divided. A massive grin spread across Spencer's face. He leaned back, practically vibrating with triumph. He loudly declared that he fully welcomed an audit. He boasted that his finances were completely transparent and offered to pay the auditors exorbitant fees, using the cash from his brand new second mortgage. He looked at me, expecting me to crumble, completely under the weight of his intimidation. I knew I had to play my part flawlessly. I let my shoulders drop and forced a look of pure panic into my eyes. I pleaded with the mediator, my voice intentionally shaking. I argued that opening Aura Staging's confidential books would ruin my business relationships and expose private client data. I begged them to reconsider. My fake desperation was the perfect fuel for Spencer's ego. He laughed out loud, pointing a finger at me across the table. He told the mediator my panic was all the proof they needed. The mediator ignored my pleas and officially signed the order. He scheduled the final discovery meeting for the following Friday. When the mediation concluded, I quickly gathered my purse and walked out to the elevator. Spencer and Beatrice followed me down to the opulent marble lobby of the law firm. They cornered me near the revolving doors. Spencer stood aggressively close, looking down at my plain beige dress with utter disgust. He told me the auditor was going to rip my fake company apart, find every single cent I had stolen, and ensure I went straight to federal prison. Beatrice stepped up beside him, clutching her designer handbag. She smiled wickedly and proudly, announced that she had spent the entire week calling every single member of their extended family. She bragged that she had exposed my true nature to everyone. She told me my name was completely ruined, that the entire family knew I was a manipulative criminal, and that not a single person felt sorry for me. I simply nodded, looking thoroughly defeated, and walked out the revolving doors into the busy city street. I turned the corner out of their sight and immediately dropped the terrified act. I pulled out my phone, called Riley, and told her to prepare the final corporate documents. The trap was set. 1 week later, I returned to the same sleek conference room. I wore a sharp, tailored black suit instead of the cheap beige dress. I walked with my head held high. Spencer was already seated, flanked by his lawyer and his mother. He looked incredibly smug, drumming his fingers on the table, eagerly waiting for the auditor to hand him my company on a silver platter. Exactly at 2 o'clock, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. The court-appointed independent forensic accountant walked in. It was Jamal. Spencer blinked in confusion for a moment. Then a massive relieved smile broke across his face. He stood up, assuming his brother-in-law had pulled some strings to get assigned to our case. Spencer reached across the table enthusiastically, welcoming Jamal, loudly saying it was great to have family on his side to help take down a thief. Jamal did not reach out to shake Spencer's hand. He did not smile. He walked to the head of the table, set his heavy leather briefcase down, and unbuttoned his suit jacket. Jamal looked at Spencer with absolute cold, professional detachment. Jamal stated clearly that he was not here as family. He announced that he was a licensed forensic accountant, acting strictly as an independent contractor, bound by federal law to report the exact financial truth. He pulled a thick stack of audited financial records from his briefcase and dropped them onto the glass table. With a heavy thud, he looked Spencer dead in the eye and said they were going to start by discussing Spencer's hidden corporate embezzlement. The weekend sun beat down on the manicured lawn of Caroline and Jamal's suburban home. The smell of charcoal and grilled cedar filled the air, mixing with the sharp clinking of iced tea glasses. To any outsider, it looked like a picture-perfect family weekend. But the moment Spencer and I walked through the wooden side gate, the atmosphere shifted. The casual laughter died down, replaced by tight smiles and averted eyes. Beatrice had clearly done her work. She had spent the last 48 hours calling every aunt, uncle, and cousin in the family directory to spread her venom. Spencer immediately abandoned me near the entrance. He walked over to the patio, grabbing a cold beer and joining his uncles. He deliberately slumped his shoulders, playing the role of the exhausted loyal husband, who was desperately trying to hold his life together. It was a pathetic performance, but his family ate it up. I was left standing alone by the drinks cooler, completely isolated. I watched from a distance as Beatrice held court on a pristine white lawn chair. She leaned in close to one of the aunts, her voice a theatrical stage whisper that was intentionally loud enough for me to hear. Beatrice clutched her chest, claiming she had found shocking evidence of my illegal financial activities. She told them I was running a fraudulent shell company, siphoning Spencer's hard-earned money to fund a secret lifestyle. She painted herself as the heroic matriarch who had uncovered a massive criminal conspiracy just in time to save her son. The aunt gasped, shooting me a look of absolute disgust. I did not react. I simply picked up a bottle of sparkling water and twisted off the cap. Let them talk. Let Beatrice dig the hole deeper. Every lie she told today would only make her eventual humiliation more profound, while the rest of the family treated me like a convicted criminal. One person remained entirely observant and aloof. Jamal, my 35-year-old brother-in-law, stood near the massive stainless steel grill, expertly flipping burgers. Jamal was a brilliant forensic accountant. He had married Spencer's sister Caroline 5 years ago. Despite his massive success, Beatrice and Spencer had always treated Jamal with a subtle, underlying condescension. They underestimated him, just like they underestimated me. Jamal wiped his hands on a towel and walked over to the cooler where I was standing. He knelt down, pretending to search for a specific brand of soda. In the ice, he did not look up at me, but his voice was calm and deliberate. He told me I needed to watch my back. He said the family gossip was annoying, but it was not the real threat. Jamal revealed that Spencer had called him late on Thursday night. Spencer had asked for a private, off-the-record conversation. According to Jamal, Spencer had spent nearly an hour aggressively grilling him about the legal loopholes for seizing a spouse's business assets. During an emergency divorce proceeding, Spencer wanted to know exactly how to pierce a corporate veil and force the liquidation of a privately held company. Jamal finally stood up holding a can of soda. He looked me dead in the eye. He said he had been doing forensic accounting for high net worth individuals. For a decade he knew how greedy men sounded when they just wanted more money. But Spencer did not sound greedy. Spencer sounded terrified. Jamal leaned in slightly, lowering his voice even further. He told me that, based on the highly specific questions Spencer was asking about hidden liabilities and immediate cash liquidation, Spencer was not trying to steal my company to get rich. Spencer was trying to steal my company to cover a massive, immediate financial deficit. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place in my mind. The sudden demand for my SUV, the frantic restriction of our joint checking accounts, the desperate, sweaty look in Spencer's eyes when Beatrice showed him the $12 million contract. Spencer was drowning. He had likely committed severe financial fraud at his tech firm, and his time to pay it back was rapidly running out. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. But inside, a sharp thrill of anticipation coursed through me. I thanked Jamal quietly. I told him his intuition was sharper than he knew, and I promised him that when the dust finally settled, he and Caroline would not be caught in the crossfire. Jamal gave me a single understanding nod and walked back to the grill. The rest of the barbecue felt entirely different. When Beatrice glared at me from her lawn chair, I no longer saw a menacing bully. I saw a foolish woman defending a sinking ship. When Spencer laughed with his uncles, I saw the frantic desperation hiding behind his smile. They thought they were backing me into a corner. They did not realize I had just been handed the exact blueprints to their total destruction. Monday morning arrived with a torrential downpour, perfectly mirroring the storm brewing. Inside my corporate headquarters, I was sitting at the expansive mahogany desk in my penthouse office, watching the city traffic crawl through the rain below. My phone screen suddenly lit up with a new notification. It was Beatrice. She had sent the same photograph of the $12 million contract again, but this time she had attached a voice message. I pressed play and let her venomous voice fill the quiet, luxurious room. Beatrice sounded breathless with excitement, completely drunk on her perceived power. She explicitly stated that this was my final warning. She demanded I send the legal paperwork transferring 80% of my business to Spencer by 5 o'clock that evening. If she did not receive the signed documents, she promised to personally drive to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and hand them the evidence of my corporate fraud. She ended the recording with a sharp, mocking laugh, telling me it was time to finally pay for my lies. I let the recording finish and placed the phone flat on my desk. I needed her to feel completely in control. I needed her to step so far out onto the ledge that when I finally pushed her, there would be no ground left to catch her. I picked up the phone and typed out a reply, deliberately making my sentences short and frantic. I intentionally misspelled a word to really sell the panic. I begged her for just a few more days. I told her the corporate lawyers were moving as fast as they could, and I pleaded with her not to ruin my entire life over this. I hit send and watched the read receipt appear. Almost instantly, her reply came seconds later. A single arrogant thumbs up emoji. She had taken the bait hook, line and sinker with Beatrice. Temporarily pacified by her own massive ego, I turned my attention to the real weapon in my arsenal. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and asked Riley to send in my lead corporate attorney. A moment later, David, the brilliant head of my legal acquisitions team, walked into the office, carrying a thick encrypted tablet. I instructed David to give me a full, unrestricted update on our impending corporate buyout, the $12 million contract Beatrice had stolen and photographed was never a valuation of my own company. It was a hostile takeover bid. Horror Staging and Acquisitions was in the final stages of purchasing the exact mid-level technology firm where Spencer worked as a vice president of sales. I was essentially buying his entire employer out from under him. When you acquire a company, you get full access to their internal financial records. During the due diligence phase, David placed the tablet on my desk and swiped open a highly detailed financial spreadsheet. He told me the forensic accounting team had spent the entire weekend digging into the sales department ledgers at the tech firm. What they found was staggering. Jamal had been absolutely right at the family barbecue. Spencer was not just drowning in debt. He was actively committing severe corporate embezzlement. Over the past 18 months, Spencer had created fake vendor invoices and funneled company money into untraceable offshore accounts. The sheer audacity of his crimes was breathtaking. David pointed to a highlighted figure at the bottom of the glowing screen. Spencer had stolen nearly $800,000 from his own employer. The money was entirely gone, likely blown on terrible investments, gambling, or the lavish lifestyle he constantly used to impress his mother and his peers. Spencer was a desperate, cornered animal. He was frantically trying to steal my supposed shell company so he could liquidate it and replace the stolen funds before his employer's upcoming quarterly audit exposed him. If he failed to replace that money, he would not just lose his prestigious job, he would face decades in a federal penitentiary. I stared at the glaring red numbers on the tablet. A cold, ruthless satisfaction washed over my entire body. Spencer had treated me like a financial burden. For our entire marriage, he had constantly belittled me for not contributing enough to his grand life. All the while he was nothing but a common thief, building a house of cards on stolen cash. And Beatrice, with all her aristocratic pride and judgment, was actively blackmailing me to save her criminal son. I looked up at David and instructed him to finalize the technology firm buyout immediately. I wanted the ink dry and my name listed as the majority shareholder by the end of the week. I also told him to quietly prepare a formal termination letter for the vice president of sales, citing gross misconduct and corporate fraud. Spencer thought he had given me an ultimatum. He thought he was the one counting down the clock. He had absolutely no idea that I now owned the clock, the company, and his entire future. By 5 o'clock that evening, the torrential downpour had turned the city streets into rushing rivers. I sat quietly in my penthouse office, watching the digital clock on my desk turn from 4:59 to 5:00. The deadline Beatrice had so arrogantly set for me to surrender 80% of my company had officially passed. I did not send a single document. I did not even send a text message. I simply sat in the quiet luxury of my office, waiting for the inevitable explosion. It did not take long. At exactly 5:15, my phone began to vibrate violently against the mahogany desk. It was a rapid succession of text messages from Spencer. I picked up the phone and opened the chat. The first message was a photograph. It showed the front porch of our suburban house, completely battered by the heavy rain. Sitting right in the middle of the puddles were 6 massive black plastic garbage bags. Spencer had followed up the photo with a paragraph of pure venom. He wrote that since I had chosen to be a stubborn, greedy criminal, he had officially erased me from his life. He bragged that he had gone up into the attic and cleared out the very last of my personal belongings. He had taken my childhood photo albums, the handmade quilts my late grandmother had left me, and every sentimental item I had stored away, shoved them into garbage bags, and thrown them out into the storm. His next message was even more cruel. He stated that he had brought in a locksmith to completely replace every deadbolt on the house and install a brand new digital security system. He told me that my fingerprint had been wiped from the garage keypad. He typed that I could enjoy rotting in a downtown homeless shelter because I would never step foot inside that house again unless I showed up with the signed equity transfer papers in my hand. He ended his rant by saying that his mother was drafting her statement for the federal authorities, and that my time was completely up. A normal woman would have broken down. Seeing your most cherished memories tossed into the freezing rain by the man who vowed to protect you would be enough to shatter anyone. But I did not feel sorrow. I felt an overwhelming sense of vindication. Spencer was lashing out with extreme cruelty. because he was trapped. He was a desperate man, watching the walls close in, trying to use brute force to extract the money he needed to cover his own massive corporate embezzlement. I set the phone down and pressed the intercom button to call my assistant, Riley. I told her to immediately dispatch our private corporate security team to the suburban house. I gave her strict instructions that the team was to quietly retrieve the 6 garbage bags from the front porch and bring them directly to my penthouse. I told her that if Spencer opened the door or tried to cause a scene, the security team was to simply ignore him and complete the retrieval. 45 minutes later, Riley walked into my office. She looked completely drenched, but offered a triumphant smile. The security team had secured the bags before the heavy rain could seep through the thick plastic and damage my grandmother's quilts. Spencer had not even stepped outside to confront the guards. He had merely peeked through the living room blinds, like a coward, as 4 men in dark suits quietly cleared the porch. I thanked Riley and asked her to have the bags brought up to my private residence. I then turned my attention back to the glowing screen of my encrypted tablet. David, my lead corporate attorney, had just emailed over the final drafts of the technology firm acquisition. I scrolled to the very last page of the dense legal document. There, typed in clear bold letters, was my name, listed as the sole majority shareholder of Spencer's employer. The ink was figuratively dry. I owned the company. Right below the acquisition agreement was a separate PDF file. It was the formal termination letter for the vice president of sales. Spencer's name was printed cleanly at the top. The letter detailed immediate dismissal for gross misconduct, unauthorized diversion of company funds, and severe breach of fiduciary duty. It also noted that all findings of his $800,000 embezzlement would be immediately forwarded to the federal authorities for criminal prosecution. I pulled a sleek digital stylus from my desk drawer. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I signed my name. At the bottom of the termination letter, Spencer had locked me out of a house I did not even want. Thinking he was securing his ultimate victory, he had told me to sleep in a homeless shelter. He had absolutely no idea that by this time tomorrow, he would be the one without a job, without a home, and facing the very federal agents he and his mother had threatened me with. I powered down the tablet, stood up from my desk, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. The storm outside was finally beginning to clear. The real storm, however, was just about to hit them. I left my corporate office and took the private elevator down to the secure underground parking garage. Riley had my driver waiting in the tinted luxury sedan. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and reflecting the neon lights of the downtown skyline. The short drive to my residential property gave me a moment to decompress. Spencer thought he had banished me to the unforgiving streets. But the reality was far different. The sedan pulled up to the most exclusive residential high-rise in the financial district. I stepped out, greeting the night concierge by name, and walked into the private elevator, reserved solely for the top floor. The doors glided open directly into my $8 million residential penthouse. This was the crown jewel of my personal real estate portfolio, purchased years ago through a blind trust. The space was breathtaking. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire living area, offering an unobstructed, glittering view of the city I now quietly controlled. The floors were imported Italian marble, and the air smelled faintly of expensive vanilla and cedar. It was a world entirely insulated from the pathetic suburban squabbles of Spencer and his mother. I walked into the custom chef kitchen. opened the glass refrigerator, and pulled out a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. I poured a glass. The golden bubbles, catching the ambient light of the city below, and walked over to the sprawling velvet sofa in the center of the room. My security team had already delivered the black garbage bags containing my grandmother's quilts and childhood photo albums. They sat neatly in the corner of the room, completely safe and dry. I sank into the plush cushions, resting my bare feet on the silk rug. It was time to finish weaving the net around Spencer. I picked up my phone and saw that he was active on his social media accounts. He had just posted a picture of a glass of expensive whiskey, with a caption about making tough choices and cutting out toxic energy. He was genuinely celebrating. He believed he had completely broken me. I opened our text message thread. If I was going to destroy him in family court, I needed documented, undeniable proof of his malicious intent and financial abuse. I needed him to explicitly state that he was extorting me for the rights to my company. I needed a paper trail, proving he had unlawfully locked me out of the marital home and deliberately left me in a dangerous situation to force a financial settlement. I began typing, forcing my words to sound pathetic and broken. I told him the homeless shelters downtown were completely full because of the heavy rain. I begged him to send me just $50 so I could afford a cheap motel room for the night. I typed that I was cold frightened and sitting alone at a bus stop. I begged him to show some mercy and let me come back to the house, promising we could figure everything out in the morning. I hit send, set the phone on the coffee table, and took a slow, satisfying sip of my champagne. The response came less than 2 minutes later. Spencer was too arrogant to ignore an opportunity to gloat. His text message popped onto my screen, dripping with malice. He told me that choices have consequences, and that I was finally learning my place. He explicitly wrote that he would not send me a single dime of his money. He stated that I was a criminal who had stolen from him, and until I sent him the legally binding documents transferring 80% of my business equity directly into his name, I could sleep on the concrete. He even added that his mother, Beatrice, was sitting right next to him, laughing at my pathetic situation. He told me to stop texting him and start calling my lawyers, because the longer I waited to surrender the company, the longer I would stay on the streets. It was perfect. It was everything I needed. He had just put his extortion demands in writing, clearly linking his refusal to provide marital support to his demand for my corporate assets. Any family court judge in the country would look at these text messages and immediately recognize extreme financial abuse and coercion. Spencer thought he was acting like a powerful, dominant executive. In reality, he was behaving like an amateur criminal, leaving his fingerprints all over the crime scene. I took screenshots of every single message and forwarded them directly to David, my lead corporate attorney. I added a brief note telling David to attach these messages to our upcoming legal filings. I then turned my phone entirely on silent and tossed it onto the plush cushions beside me. I leaned back against the velvet sofa and looked out over the glowing city skyline. Champagne tasted sweeter than it ever had before. Spencer and Beatrice were sitting in that heavily mortgaged suburban house, drinking whiskey and celebrating a victory that did not exist. They were utterly clueless that their entire world was about to collapse. I closed my eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the city, ready for the legal warfare that would begin. The very next morning. The next morning. The bright city sun streamed through the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, completely erasing the gloom of the previous night. I woke up feeling incredibly refreshed. I drank a cup of premium black coffee, took a long shower in my marble bathroom, and then, deliberately dressed for the role I needed to play, I bypassed my tailored designer business suits and pulled out a faded beige cardigan, a plain cotton shirt and sensible flat shoes. I had to look exactly like the defeated, financially struggling housewife Spencer believed he had conquered. My private driver dropped me off 2 blocks away from my destination to ensure no one saw me stepping out of a tinted luxury sedan. I walked the rest of the way to the downtown collaborative workspace, where I maintained my fake home decor blog. The building was an older 10-story commercial high-rise, with a slightly run-down brick exterior, and a lobby that smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. I rented a tiny cramped desk on the 3rd floor. What Spencer and his mother absolutely did not know was that Aura Staging and Acquisitions had quietly purchased this entire commercial building 2 years ago. I was not just a tenant, renting a cheap desk under fluorescent lights. I was the landlord of the entire high-rise, currently holding it in a subsidiary portfolio for future luxury redevelopment. I walked into the 3rd floor open workspace, nodded politely to the college students and freelance writers sharing the area, and sat down at my cramped little desk. I opened my cheap laptop and waited. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the collaborative workspace swung open. Loudly Spencer walked in, projecting an air of absolute arrogance. He was wearing his best custom-tailored suit, his chest puffed out like a conqueror. But he was not alone. Walking right beside him was a man in an incredibly flashy, aggressive pinstripe suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase. They marched straight past the receptionist and walked directly to my tiny corner desk. Spencer looked around the open office, his face contorting into a mask of pure disgust. He loudly commented on the cheap plastic chairs and the dingy carpet, intentionally making sure the other people in the room could hear him. He looked down at me and laughed, stating that this pathetic little dump was exactly where a talentless fraud like me belonged. I kept my hands resting quietly on my keyboard, forcing my eyes to widen in mock fear. I asked him what he was doing here, and begged him to keep his voice down, so he would not get me kicked out of the shared office. My fake panic only fueled his massive ego. The man in the pinstripe suit stepped forward and slammed a thick, heavy manila envelope right onto my laptop keyboard. The loud smack echoed across the quiet workspace. The man introduced himself as Mr. Thorne, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and expensive family law firms in the city. He did not bother with any professional courtesy. He looked at me with cold, predatory eyes and announced that I had officially been served. Thorne stated that the envelope contained an emergency ex-parte petition for the dissolution of our marriage, along with an aggressive demand for immediate asset division. He crossed his arms and told me that, since I had supposedly built my secret company while married to Spencer, living under his roof, and surviving on his financial provisions, Aura Staging was legally considered marital property. Thorne declared that they were demanding an immediate payout of $6 million, exactly half of the stolen contract valuation, plus full coverage of their exorbitant legal fees. Spencer leaned over the desk, invading my personal space. He bragged that Mr. Thorne charged over $1,000 an hour. He proudly announced that he had just taken out a massive $400,000 second mortgage on our suburban house, just to keep Thorne on retainer. He told me he was going to drag this legal battle out until I was entirely bankrupt, starving on the streets and begging him for mercy. I looked down at the thick envelope, biting the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. Spencer was standing inside a commercial building that I owned, threatening me with a predatory lawyer he was paying for with a bank loan that I also owned. He was willingly burying himself in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to fight a war he had already lost. I looked up at Spencer, letting my lower lip tremble just a little bit. I asked him how he could do this to me, after everything we had been through. Mr. Thorne interrupted, tapping his expensive gold pen against the envelope. He told me I had exactly 48 hours to review the documents and attend a mandatory legal mediation at his downtown office. He warned that if I did not show up ready to surrender the $6 million, they would bypass family court altogether, walk straight to the federal authorities with the stolen contract, and ensure I was indicted for corporate fraud. Spencer gave me one final triumphant smirk. He told me to enjoy the cheap coffee, and turned around, walking out of the workspace, with his attack dog right behind him. I waited until the glass doors swung shut. Then I calmly picked up the divorce petition, tossed it into my tote bag, and pulled out my phone to call my building manager. I instructed him to immediately tow a specific luxury sedan if it was parked in my private loading zone downstairs. The game was on. 48 hours later, I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of Mr. Thorne's downtown law firm. The office was designed specifically to intimidate. Everything was sleek glass, dark wood, and polished chrome. The air conditioning was aggressively cold, adding to the sterile, hostile environment. I wore the exact same faded beige cardigan from the co-working space, clutching a cheap canvas tote bag tightly against my chest. The receptionist directed me to conference room B. When I pushed the heavy glass door open, Spencer and Thorne were already seated on one side of a massive granite table. The court-appointed mediator, an older man with tired eyes and a stack of yellow legal pads, sat at the head. Spencer looked like a king holding court. He wore a brand new custom-tailored suit, likely paid for by the second mortgage he had just recklessly taken out. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water, offering me a look of pure, unadulterated pity. I took my seat on the opposite side, keeping my head bowed. The mediator introduced himself formally and explained the strict rules of the session. He stated that the goal today was to find a mutually agreeable separation of assets, without resorting to a lengthy, highly public trial. Before the mediator could even finish his opening remarks, Thorne slapped a thick leather binder onto the granite table. The loud smack echoed sharply in the quiet room. Thorne stood up, buttoning his aggressive pinstripe suit, and began his theatrical legal performance. He announced that his client was the sole financial provider for our entire marriage. He stated that Spencer had graciously allowed me to pursue a harmless internet hobby to keep me occupied, while he carried the massive burden of funding our suburban lifestyle. Thorne's voice dripped with condescension as he pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. He declared that because my supposed hobby had somehow morphed into a multi-million-dollar corporate entity, Spencer was legally entitled to exactly half of its total valuation. Thorne opened the binder and pulled out a stack of printed utility bills and bank statements. He slid them aggressively across the table toward the mediator. Thorne argued his ridiculous legal theory with absolute confidence. He stated that aura staging and acquisitions was entirely a marital asset because of the household resources I consumed while building it. He claimed that I had used the home internet router, which Spencer paid for every month. He argued that I had used the marital electricity to charge my laptop. Most outrageously, Thorne pointed to the monthly $500 allowance Spencer had deposited into my checking account. Thorne claimed that this meager allowance acted as the crucial seed money for my entire corporate empire. He argued that every cup of coffee I bought while working, every notebook I purchased, and the rental fee for my tiny desk at the co-working space were all funded directly by Spencer. Therefore, Thorne concluded, Spencer was the primary investor in Aura Staging and was owed a mandatory buyout of exactly $6 million. Spencer could not resist chiming in to cement his dominance. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the granite table, his eyes locked onto mine. He told the mediator that he had sacrificed his own peace of mind for my success. He claimed his high-pressure job as a tech executive was the absolute only thing that kept a roof over my head, giving me the free time and the safety net required to play businesswoman. He actually had the audacity to say he was proud of me for taking his money and doing something productive with it. But now it was time to pay the piper. Spencer told me that if I simply sign the $6 million settlement agreement right now, he would be generous enough to let me keep the remaining half of the company, and he would ensure the federal authorities were never called. I looked down at my hands deliberately, letting my fingers shake visibly. I forced my breathing to become shallow and erratic. I stammered, telling them that taking $6 million in liquid cash would completely bankrupt the holding company and destroy everything I had built. I pleaded with the mediator, asking if this was truly how the justice system worked. Outwardly, I was the perfect picture of a broken, desperate woman about to lose her life's work. Inwardly, my mind was perfectly calm. I knew exactly what family law dictated regarding non-marital assets protected by blind inheritance trusts. Their internet router argument was legally laughable. But I needed them to push harder, needed them to commit entirely to this extortion before I sprang the final trap. Just as the mediator opened his mouth to respond to my trembling question, the heavy glass door of conference room B was shoved violently open. It hit the interior wall with a loud thud that made everyone at the table jump. A young flustered receptionist hovered in the doorway, desperately apologizing to the room. But she was easily brushed aside. Standing in the threshold, vibrating with theatrical indignation, was Beatrice. She had dressed specifically for a performance. She wore a dark, conservative suit and clutched her expensive leather handbag like a weapon. Without waiting for an invitation, she marched directly into the room and positioned herself right behind Spencer's chair. She placed both of her hands on her son's shoulders, casting her gaze downward, as if she were comforting a deeply wounded victim. The mediator immediately raised his hand, his voice firm and professional. He stated clearly that mediation was a strictly closed legal proceeding. He informed Beatrice that only the married parties and their official legal counsel were permitted inside the room, and he politely asked her to return to the lobby. Beatrice completely ignored him. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh that filled the quiet conference room. She announced that she could not sit out in that waiting room for another single second. While a manipulative liar tried to cheat her son out of his rightful property, she pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her voice rising in pitch. She told the mediator that he had no idea what kind of monster was sitting across from him. She claimed that I had spent the last 5 years leeching off her son's generosity, using his hard-earned money to build an illegal corporate empire right under his nose. Mr. Thorne, recognizing that Beatrice was violating every rule of a controlled legal negotiation, tried to gently intervene. He raised his hands, assuring Beatrice that they had the situation entirely under control and that the settlement was being finalized. But Beatrice was entirely drunk on her own perceived power. She was not going to let a lawyer steal her moment of triumph. She swatted Thorne's hand away and leaned heavily over the granite table. She declared that $6 million was absolutely not enough. Beatrice looked the mediator dead in the eye and demanded that the court immediately seize every single bank account associated with my name or my company. She argued that her son was a victim of severe emotional distress and prolonged psychological abuse. She painted a ridiculous picture of Spencer working himself to the bone, losing sleep and sacrificing his health, all while I was secretly hoarding millions of dollars. Like a criminal mastermind. She insisted that I was a massive flight risk. She claimed that if they let me walk out of this building today with access to my corporate funds, I would immediately wire the money to offshore accounts and disappear. Therefore, Beatrice reasoned, the only fair course of action was to freeze my entire life. She demanded that all the money be placed directly into Spencer's control as a down payment for his emotional suffering. Spencer instantly fed off his mother's aggressive energy. Instead of asking her to leave, he sat up straighter, puffing out his chest. He loudly agreed with her, telling the mediator that his mother was absolutely right. Spencer claimed that my hesitation to sign the settlement document was proof that I was planning to hide the assets. He began shouting across the table, demanding that I hand over my corporate account numbers right this second, or he would make sure I ended up in a federal jail cell before dinner. The room descended into absolute chaos. Thorne began aggressively tapping his gold pen on the table, trying to speak over his own client to legally justify the seizure of my accounts. Spencer was yelling about my supposed crimes. Beatrice was crying fake dramatic tears, demanding justice for her family. The mediator was visibly losing his patience. He rubbed his temples, his face turning red, as he repeatedly ordered them to stop speaking. He banged the palm of his hand against the table, warning Thorne that if he could not control his client and his client's mother, the session would be terminated immediately. Through all the yelling and the chaos, I sat perfectly still. I shrank down into my chair, pulling my cheap, beige cardigan tighter around my shoulders. I kept my eyes wide and terrified, completely playing the role of the helpless victim, being cornered by a pack of wolves. But behind my terrified expression, my mind was racing with absolute glee. Beatrice had just crashed an official, documented legal proceeding to openly demand all of my money out of pure greed and malice. The mediator was witnessing their unhinged, extortionate behavior firsthand. They thought they were applying the ultimate pressure to break me. They did not realize they were just handing me the final nails for their own coffin. The mediator slammed both of his hands flat against the granite table, the loud crack slicing through the chaotic shouting. He pointed a stern finger at Beatrice and told her that if she spoke one more word, he would have building security forcibly remove her and file a formal report with the judge regarding her interference. Beatrice snapped her mouth shut, her face flushing a deep angry red. Thorne quickly pulled Spencer back into his leather chair, whispering furiously into his ear to stand down. The mediator took a deep, exhausted breath and straightened his tie. He announced that it was abundantly clear a peaceful settlement was completely impossible today. He pulled a fresh, yellow legal pad toward him and began writing aggressively. He stated that since Spencer and his legal counsel were making severe allegations of hidden marital assets, corporate fraud and offshore accounts, standard mediation procedures no longer applied. He looked directly at Spencer and Thorne, informing them that he was officially suspending the mediation and petitioning the family court judge for a mandatory comprehensive forensic audit. The mediator emphasized that this audit would not just focus on aura staging and acquisitions. It would be a total, invasive examination of both parties, every single bank account, credit line, investment portfolio, tax return, and corporate ledger from the past 5 years would be torn apart by an independent court-appointed accountant. A slow predatory grin spread across Spencer's face. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the table, completely unbothered by the prospect of his own finances being examined. He was so blinded by the $12 million valuation he thought he was about to steal that his own massive embezzlement completely slipped his mind. He arrogantly told the mediator that he welcomed the audit with open arms. He bragged that his books were perfectly clean, his corporate record was spotless, and that he could not wait for the court to expose exactly how much money his wife had stolen from him. This was my cue. I let out a sharp trembling gasp. Burying my face in my hands, I forced my shoulders to shake violently. Sobbing loudly into the quiet conference room, I peered through my fingers, looking at the mediator with wide, terrified eyes. I begged him not to order the audit. I cried that opening my corporate books would completely destroy my business. I pleaded that my high-profile clients demanded absolute confidentiality, and if a court investigator started digging through our financial agreements, it would ruin my professional reputation forever. I told the mediator that they were destroying my privacy and breaking my life apart, just to satisfy Spencer's uncontrollable greed. My fake desperation was like blood in the water. To Spencer he laughed aloud, a cruel echoing sound that filled the room. He pointed at me triumphantly, telling his lawyer that my tears were all the proof they needed. He loudly declared that guilty people were the only ones who cried when the accountants showed up. He leaned across the table and told me that my little masquerade was finally over. He promised that the auditor was going to find every single dime I had hidden and hand it right over to him. Beatrice, unable to completely contain herself, let out a smug chuckle from the back of the room. She whispered loudly that I was finally getting exactly what I deserved for deceiving her son. Thorne just packed his briefcase, looking incredibly satisfied, likely calculating the massive percentage he was going to take from Spencer's impending $6 million windfall. The mediator ignored my sobbing. He formally stamped the legal document and slid copies across the table to both Thorne and myself. He announced that the audit was officially ordered and that the court would assign an independent financial investigator by Monday morning. He warned us both that attempting to move, hide or to destroy any financial documents from this moment forward was a federal crime. With that he dismissed the room. Spencer stood up, buttoning his custom suit jacket. He looked down at me, still huddled and shaking in my cheap beige cardigan. He told me to enjoy my last few days of freedom before the auditor uncovered my fraud. He turned and walked out of the conference room, closely followed by Thorne and Beatrice, who threw one last victorious glare in my direction. The heavy glass door swung shut behind them, sealing me alone inside the room. The moment the latch clicked into place, my tears stopped completely. My shaking shoulders stilled. I picked up the stamped audit order from the table, folded it neatly into my canvas tote bag and smiled. Spencer thought the audit was his ultimate weapon. He had no idea it was his execution order. I folded the stamped court order, slid it carefully into my canvas tote bag, and took one final deep breath. The cold, sterile air of Conference Room B had served its purpose. Perfectly, I stood up, smoothed out the wrinkles in my faded beige cardigan, and walked out into the main hallway. I kept my head slightly bowed, maintaining the posture of a thoroughly defeated woman, as I stepped into the glass elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. When the elevator doors glided open to the expansive marble lobby, I expected to walk straight out of the building. But Spencer was not done with me yet. He was standing near the towering glass revolving doors, leaning casually against a polished marble pillar. He had clearly sent his lawyer away and told his mother to wait in the car, just so he could have one final moment of uninterrupted cruelty. As I walked toward the exit, he stepped directly into my path, forcing me to stop. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my cheap shoes and plain clothes, with an expression of profound disgust. He crossed his arms over his custom-tailored suit jacket and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He told me I put on a very convincing performance upstairs, but tears were not going to save me from federal prison. He bragged that the forensic auditor was going to rip my fake little company apart, piece by piece, and he was going to enjoy watching every single second of my total humiliation. I pulled my tote bag tighter against my chest, forcing my voice to stay quiet and timid. I asked him why he was doing this, reminding him that a legal battle of this magnitude would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I asked him how he could possibly afford to keep a predatory lawyer like Mr. Thorne on retainer for a prolonged forensic investigation. Spencer practically beamed with arrogance. He took a step closer, invading my personal space, his voice dropping to a low, triumphant whisper. He told me he had endless funds for this war. He proudly confessed that just 48 hours ago, he had successfully secured a $400,000 second mortgage on our suburban house. He emphasized the words his house, making sure I understood that I had no claim to it. He boasted that his stellar executive salary at the technology firm made the bank practically throw the cash at him. He declared that he had a massive war chest, ready to completely bury me in legal fees, and he would not stop until I was absolutely destroyed. He leaned back, a malicious smile stretching across his face. He asked me how I was enjoying my new life on the streets. He mocked my clothes, asking if the downtown homeless shelters provided laundry services, or if I just had to smell like desperation all week. He reached into his tailored pants pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and held it out toward me. He sarcastically suggested I take it, so I could at least buy a warm meal before the court seized my remaining bank accounts. I looked at the $20 bill, then up at his smug, arrogant face. I did not take the money. I just shook my head slowly, letting a look of utter despair wash over my features. I whispered that he was making a terrible mistake, and that he was going to lose everything he cared about. Spencer laughed again, shoving the $20 bill back into his pocket. He told me the only person losing everything was me. He stepped aside dramatically, gesturing toward the revolving doors, telling me to get out of his sight. I walked past him, pushing through the heavy glass doors and stepping out into the bright downtown sunlight. The moment I was safely lost in the crowded city sidewalk, my posture completely transformed. I stood up perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back and letting out a genuine, joyful laugh. Spencer had just willingly confessed his entire hidden financial strategy. He had bragged about taking a massive loan from Capital Bank to fund his legal assault. He was completely oblivious to the fact that, just 3 weeks ago, a private equity subsidiary, fully owned and controlled by Aura Staging, had aggressively purchased a massive portfolio of high-risk residential loans directly from Capital Bank. Spencer did not just mortgage his house, he mortgaged his house to me. He was literally paying his exorbitant lawyer, using my money, and he had legally pledged his only remaining physical asset to my corporation as collateral. He thought he was burying me, but he had just handed me the very deed to his own grave. The following Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting wind that swept through the downtown financial district. The family court judge had ordered an immediate, mandatory, kick-off meeting for the forensic investigation, instead of the opulent, intimidating law firm we had visited previously. This meeting took place in a sterile, windowless conference room inside the county courthouse. The walls were painted a dull institutional beige, and the air smelled heavily of old paper and stale floor wax. I arrived exactly 15 minutes early, taking a seat at the far end of the scuffed wooden table. I wore a modest navy blouse and kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, projecting the image of a woman bracing for total financial ruin. Spencer walked in 10 minutes later, bringing all of his suffocating arrogance into the small room. Mr. Thorne, his predatory lawyer, trailed closely behind him, carrying his expensive leather briefcase. Spencer did not look like a man about to undergo a rigorous federal financial audit. He looked like a man arriving to collect a winning lottery ticket. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and a bright, aggressive red tie. He pulled out a chair opposite me, completely ignoring my presence, and began laughing loudly at a joke Thorne had just made. They spent the next few minutes openly discussing their strategy right in front of me. Spencer leaned back in his chair, casually scrolling through his phone. He bragged to Thorne about a luxury ski trip he was planning to book. The moment the audit concluded, and the judge awarded him my $6 million, Thorne simply nodded, tapping his gold pen against his legal pad, clearly calculating his massive percentage of the impending payout. Spencer occasionally shot me a cruel, pitying glance. He truly believed that within the next hour, a court-appointed accountant would tear open my corporate ledgers, expose my supposed fraud, and hand him the keys to Aura Staging and Acquisitions. I sat perfectly still, allowing them to bask in their false victory. I knew exactly how independent forensic audits worked. I knew that before the investigator even looked at my thoroughly protected, legally airtight corporate holdings, they were legally required to scrutinize Spencer's personal checking accounts, his recent massive mortgage loan, and his executive compensation packages. Spencer was so focused on destroying me that he had completely forgotten about the massive trail of corporate embezzlement he had left behind at his own technology firm. At exactly 9:00 in the morning, the heavy wooden door of the courthouse conference room clicked open. The chatter between Spencer and his lawyer instantly ceased. The court-appointed independent forensic accountant stepped into the room. It was Jamal. He wore an impeccably tailored dark navy suit that commanded immediate respect. He carried 2 thick heavy leather briefcases, and his expression was completely unreadable. For a brief confusing second Spencer just blinked. His brain struggled to process why his African-American brother-in-law, a man he and his mother routinely treated with subtle condescension at family barbecues, was walking into a closed legal proceeding. Then a look of absolute blinding joy washed over Spencer's face. He completely misunderstood the situation. In his arrogant mind, Spencer assumed. Jamal had somehow pulled professional strings behind the scenes to get assigned to our specific case. Spencer thought this was the ultimate stroke of luck. He believed his family had infiltrated the court system to help him completely annihilate me. Spencer immediately stood up from his chair. A massive genuine smile broke across his face. He let out a loud, enthusiastic laugh and opened his arms wide for a brotherly embrace. He walked toward the door, loudly proclaiming that it was incredible to have family on his side. He told Jamal that the universe was finally working in his favor, and that they were going to team up to expose the criminal. Sitting across the table, Jamal did not open his arms. He did not smile. He did not even blink. Jamal stood perfectly still, letting Spencer awkwardly drop his arms. The silence in the room became instantly suffocating. Jamal walked past Spencer without saying a single word. He moved to the head of the scuffed wooden table, placed his heavy briefcases down, and unbuttoned his suit jacket. With slow, deliberate precision, he pulled out a stack of official court documents and a laminated identification badge, placing them flat on the table. When Jamal finally spoke, his voice was a weapon of pure cold, professional detachment. He looked Spencer dead in the eye and explicitly stated that he was not here as a brother-in-law. He announced that he was a sworn, licensed forensic accountant, operating as a direct agent of the federal court. He warned Spencer that any further attempts to address him informally or leverage their familial relationship would be immediately documented as an attempt to unlawfully influence a court official. Spencer slowly sank back into his chair, his joyful smile completely evaporating. The predator had just realized he was locked in a cage. Jamal did not sit down. He remained standing at the head of the scuffed wooden table, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. He snapped open the brass locks of his second leather briefcase and extracted 3 thick, perfectly bound financial dossiers. He slid one across the table to Spencer and Thorne, another over to me, and kept the final copy for himself. Thorne immediately flipped open the heavy folder, grabbing his expensive gold pen, completely ready to highlight the massive corporate fraud he arrogantly assumed was waiting inside. Spencer leaned forward in his chair, an eager, hungry glint in his eyes, literally waiting for Jamal to hand him the keys to my $6 million. Jamal cleared his throat, the sound sharp and commanding in the quiet room. He addressed the table, stating that his forensic accounting team had spent the last 72 hours executing a rigorous trace on every single financial transaction connected to aura staging and acquisitions. He turned his cold gaze directly to Mr. Thorne. Jamal stated that the legal theory, claiming the corporate entity was built using marital funds, specifically a pathetic $500 monthly allowance and a household internet router, was not just factually incorrect, it was financially impossible. Thorne stopped clicking his gold pen. He looked up from the dossier, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. Spencer scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively in the air. He told Jamal to stop playing stupid professional games and just show them the hidden bank accounts where I was hoarding his money. Jamal ignored Spencer's outburst entirely. He instructed Thorne to turn directly to page 14 of the forensic audit report. Jamal explained that aura staging was never a small startup, created in a suburban living room by a bored housewife. It was a pre-existing, highly lucrative real estate holding company that was aggressively purchased exactly 5 years ago. Thorne scanned the dense financial document, his eyes darting rapidly across the page. Slowly the arrogant flush of color began to drain, completely from the lawyer's face. Jamal continued, his voice echoing off the sterile, beige walls of the courthouse. He revealed the exact origin of the money. He stated that the entire capital required to purchase Aura Staging had originated from a private, heavily encrypted blind trust. This specific trust had been established for me by my late grandfather, many years before I ever met or married Spencer. Jamal looked directly at Spencer, whose confident, mocking smile had finally begun to fracture. Jamal explicitly stated the binding federal family law regarding the matter. Because the corporation was purchased entirely with protected, premarital inheritance funds, and because those funds were deliberately insulated and never once commingled with any joint marital, checking or savings accounts, Aura Staging and Acquisitions was legally classified as strictly non-marital property. The business, its profits, its commercial real estate holdings, and its liquid assets belonged solely and exclusively to me. Spencer was legally entitled to exactly 0 cents. The silence that descended upon the small conference room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a predator suddenly realizing it had walked directly into a massive steel trap. Spencer stared blankly at Jamal, his brain completely unable to process the devastating words he had just heard. He opened his mouth to speak, to yell, to demand an explanation, but nothing came out. He just sat there, looking like a man who had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Thorne, however, understood the severe legal implications immediately. He dropped his gold pen onto the table, the small clatter echoing loudly in the quiet room. He looked at his client with a sudden mixture of profound shock and rapidly growing anger. Thorne was a shark who only cared about his exorbitant hourly rate. He realized instantly that Spencer had absolutely no legal claim to a $6 million corporate payout, and without that massive payout, Spencer had absolutely no way to afford Thorne's massive legal retainer. Moving forward, Spencer finally found his voice. He slammed both of his fists onto the wooden table, violently shaking the heavy audit folders. He yelled that Jamal was lying to protect me. He screamed that I was a broke, talentless fraud when he met me, and that there was no rich grandfather and no hidden inheritance. He aggressively pointed his finger at his lawyer, ordering Thorne to file an immediate emergency objection with the judge to throw out the fraudulent audit. Thorne did not move to defend his client. He did not write anything down on his yellow legal pad. He simply leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his pinstriped suit, and kept staring directly at the irrefutable, court-certified bank records in front of him. He was realizing that he had just backed a man who possessed no wealth, no leverage, and no future. I sat quietly across the table, my hands neatly folded on top of my unopened audit folder. I did not smile, but a deep, profound sense of peace washed over my entire body. The first domino had officially fallen, and there was nothing Spencer could do to stop the rest from crushing him. The silence in the courthouse conference room was finally broken by the screech of wooden legs scraping against the linoleum floor. Spencer violently pushed himself away from the table, his chair tipping backward and crashing loudly to the ground. His face had transformed from a pale mask of shock into a deep mottled purple. The realization that he could not touch my corporate millions had triggered a frantic, desperate rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Jamal, then whipped his arm around to point directly at me. He screamed that he did not care about the company anymore. He yelled that if I wanted to keep my fraudulent little startup, I could have it. He paced heavily behind his fallen chair, breathing like a cornered animal. He loudly reminded everyone in the room that he was still the sole legal owner of our sprawling suburban house. He bragged that his name was the only one on the original deed, and that he had just pulled $400,000 in pure liquid cash out of its equity. Spencer pounded his fist against his chest. He declared that he was going to use every single penny of that $400,000 to hire an army of lawyers. He promised to drag me through civil court for years, suing me for emotional distress, fraud and anything else he could fabricate. He yelled that he would make my life a living hell, and that he would be sleeping comfortably in his massive house, while I continued to rot in cheap motels. Thorne, his lawyer, just sat there with his arms crossed, looking at his client with a mixture of pity and professional embarrassment. Thorne understood the law. He knew that a second mortgage was not free money. It was a massive liability strapped to an asset. But Spencer was completely manic, clinging to this cash as his ultimate weapon of vengeance. I decided my performance as the terrified, defeated wife was officially over. I sat up perfectly straight, letting the cheap beige cardigan slip off my shoulders. I reached into my canvas tote bag and bypassed the crumpled tissues I had brought for my fake tears. Instead, I pulled out a single heavy stock legal document, embossed with a gold notary seal. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a chief executive officer closing a hostile acquisition. I told Spencer that he was absolutely right about the second mortgage. He had indeed signed the paperwork for a massive loan against his house. But I asked him if he had ever bothered to read the fine print of his agreement with Capital Bank. I explained that regional banks routinely sell off packages of high-risk residential debt to private equity firms to quickly clear their balance sheets. I took the sealed document and slid it smoothly across the scuffed wooden table. I did not slide it to Spencer. His brain was too clouded by rage to understand it. I slid it directly to Mr. Thorne. Thorne uncrossed his arms and picked up the paper. His eyes darted across the bold header, then dropped immediately to the authorized signatures and corporate stamps at the bottom. Whatever color had managed to return to the lawyer's face drained away completely. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, and slowly placed the document back onto the table. Spencer stopped his frantic pacing. He demanded to know what the document was, ordering Thorne to read it out loud. Thorne did not look up at his client. He stared blankly at the wood grain of the table and quietly stated that it was a formal notice of assignment of debt. I looked Spencer dead in the eye, stripping away the legal jargon. I told him that exactly 3 weeks ago, Aura Staging and Acquisitions utilized a corporate subsidiary to purchase a bundled portfolio of residential mortgages directly from Capital Bank. I told him his specific loan was included in that exact bundle. Spencer stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between us. I told him that Capital Bank no longer owned his debt. I owned his debt. He did not borrow $400,000 from a faceless financial institution. He borrowed it directly from me. I casually reminded him of the incredibly strict terms of that specific loan. It required exorbitant monthly payments, and the house itself was pledged as the absolute sole collateral. I stated clearly that the moment he missed a single payment, my holding company possessed the unchallengeable legal authority to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings, seize the property and throw him out onto the street. Spencer started shaking his head violently, desperately, trying to reject the reality crashing down around him. He stammered that he still had the cash in his account. He puffed out his chest, declaring that his massive executive salary at the technology firm meant he could easily make the monthly payments to whoever held the paper. He yelled that my parlor trick would not stop him, and that he would never default on the loan. I just smiled. A slow, genuine, devastating smile. I told him that making those massive payments would be incredibly difficult for a man who no longer had a paycheck. He thought the mortgage was his lifeline, but he had absolutely no idea. His career had already been severed. Spencer stared at me, his eyes wide, with a mixture of confusion and absolute denial. He let out a breathless, uneven laugh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He told me I was completely delusional. He aggressively reminded the room that he was the senior vice president of sales, a vital asset to his technology firm, and that he was practically guaranteed a massive promotion by the end of the quarter. He yelled that his job was completely untouchable, and that no parlor trick with a residential mortgage was going to threaten his immense executive salary. Before I could utter a single word to shatter his final delusion, a loud commotion erupted directly outside the conference room. The heavy wooden door was suddenly shoved open, banging harshly against the wall. A flustered court bailiff stood in the hallway, but he had been aggressively pushed aside by Beatrice. She had apparently grown entirely too impatient, waiting in the lobby downstairs, and had marched upstairs to find out exactly why her son was screaming. Beatrice stormed into the room, her eyes darting from Spencer to Mr. Thorne. She saw the absolute panic etched into her son's face, and the defeated, professional distance Thorne had suddenly taken. Beatrice immediately assumed the court was somehow cheating her family. She puffed out her chest completely, ignoring the strict rules of the federal courthouse, and marched directly up to the scuffed wooden table. She declared that she had absolutely had enough of these legal games. She plunged her hand into her expensive designer handbag and aggressively pulled out a glossy, high-resolution printed photograph. It was the exact image she had stolen from my secure corporate archives just over a week ago. With a dramatic sweeping motion, Beatrice slammed the photograph face up onto the table, right squarely in front of Jamal. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the glossy paper. She screamed that she had undeniable, hard evidence of severe corporate fraud and money laundering. She looked directly at Jamal, demanding that he seize my assets immediately. She threatened that if the court did not hand over the $6 million to Spencer right this second, she was going to march straight out of the building, drive to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and personally hand them the proof, to have me locked away in a federal penitentiary forever. Jamal did not flinch. He did not look intimidated, nor did he reach for the photograph. He simply looked down at the glossy paper, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Beatrice's furious gaze. His expression was one of profound clinical pity. Jamal calmly asked Beatrice if she had ever actually bothered to read the legal text printed on the document, or if she had simply looked at the massive string of zeros and let her own staggering greed fill in the blanks. Beatrice scoffed loudly, crossing her arms defensively. She aggressively stated that it was a legally binding document, valuing my fraudulent, illegal shell company at exactly $12 million. She proudly declared that it was the absolute smoking gun, proving I had stolen her son's entire financial future. Jamal let out a slow, quiet sigh. He reached out and picked up the photograph, holding it up so both Beatrice and Spencer could clearly see it. Jamal brutally corrected her. He stated that the document she had illegally photographed was not a corporate valuation. It was not a bank statement. It was not a measure of aura staging in acquisitions. Internal equity. Jamal's voice grew louder, cutting through the sterile air of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. He explicitly defined the document as a finalized corporate acquisition agreement. He explained that aura staging did not receive $12 million. Instead, the holding company had spent $12 million in liquid capital to aggressively execute a hostile takeover of a mid-level commercial entity. Jamal turned the photograph slightly, pointing his pen directly at the second paragraph of the legal text. He read the target of the acquisition out loud. It was the exact, specific technology firm where Spencer worked. The air completely left the room. Beatrice's arms slowly dropped to her sides. She stared blankly at Jamal. The venomous arrogance completely draining from her face, leaving behind nothing but pale hollow shock. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the table. I looked directly into Spencer's wide, terrified eyes. I told him that Jamal was absolutely correct. The ink on the buyout had dried late last week. My holding company was now the sole majority shareholder of his employer. I told Spencer that he did not have an untouchable executive salary. He did not have a promotion waiting for him. And he had absolutely no way to pay the massive mortgage he now owed directly to me. I smiled coldly and formally welcomed him to my company. Spencer's jaw slackened. The arrogant, untouchable tech executive who had walked into the courthouse conference room just an hour ago completely vanished. In his place sat a terrified hollow shell of a man. He looked at his mother, expecting Beatrice to somehow fix this, to scream at the mediator, or threaten the authorities. But Beatrice was entirely frozen, her eyes wide with horror, as she stared at the glossy photograph of the acquisition agreement she had so proudly slammed onto the table. She had handed over the very document that proved her son was completely ruined. I did not give Spencer a single moment to catch his breath. I reached back into my canvas tote bag and pulled out a crisp, single-page document, printed on premium corporate letterhead. I slit it across the scuffed wooden table, placing it directly over the photograph of the $12 million contract. I told Spencer that as the new majority shareholder, an acting chief executive officer of his technology firm, my very first official duty was restructuring the senior management team. Spencer stared blindly at the paper. It was a formal termination of employment. I kept my voice completely devoid of emotion, reading the terms of his dismissal out loud, so the court-appointed mediator and his own lawyer could hear every single word. I stated that his employment was terminated immediately, effective as of 9 o'clock this morning. I told him he was stripped of all executive privileges. His corporate email was permanently disabled, and his building access card had already been deactivated by building security. I informed him that his massive quarterly bonus, the one he had been banking on to fund his luxury ski trip, and his aggressive legal retainer, was completely forfeited under the gross misconduct clause of his contract. He slowly shook his head, his hands trembling violently. As he reached out to touch the termination letter, he stammered that I could not do this. He aggressively argued that he had a binding employment contract, and that terminating a senior vice president without proper cause would result in a massive severance payout. He looked at Mr. Thorne, desperately pleading with his lawyer to intervene, to threaten me with a wrongful termination lawsuit. Before Thorne could even open his mouth, Jamal stepped forward. Jamal rested his hands heavily on the table, leaning his tall frame towards Spencer. Jamal stated that, "I was not firing Spencer without cause. The cause was severe, documented, and entirely criminal." Jamal opened his own thick leather dossier and extracted a stack of highlighted bank statements and corporate ledgers. He explained that, when the family court judge ordered a full forensic audit of both parties, the mandate granted him unrestricted access to trace all incoming and outgoing funds. Jamal stated that tracing Spencer's finances was incredibly easy because Spencer had been careless, desperate, and remarkably foolish. Jamal looked Spencer dead in the eye and revealed the crushing truth. He told the room that over the past 18 months, Spencer had systematically created fake vendor invoices and funneled nearly $800,000 from the technology firm directly into untraceable offshore accounts. Jamal explained that, during the corporate acquisition process, my legal team had already flagged the missing funds, but the court-ordered forensic audit provided the exact digital fingerprints, linking the stolen money directly to Spencer's personal computer and home internet router. Spencer's face turned a sickening shade of gray, the frantic energy completely drained from his body. He slumped back into his chair, looking like a man who was about to physically be sick. Beatrice finally found her voice. She gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace. As her face turned pale, she looked at her son, her eyes pleading for him to deny the accusations. She begged him to tell them it was a mistake, that he had never stolen anything, and that I was setting him up. But Spencer could not even look his mother in the eye. He just stared blankly at the scuffed wooden table, completely paralyzed by the reality of his own actions. Jamal continued, his voice cold and unforgiving. He stated that the audit was now an official federal document. He explained that, because the stolen funds crossed state lines through digital wire transfers, this was no longer a simple civil dispute or an internal corporate firing. It was a massive federal crime. Jamal announced that my corporate attorneys had already submitted the fully compiled evidence to the federal authorities. Earlier that morning, I leaned forward, folding my hands neatly on top of the table. I looked at Spencer and told him that his career was entirely over. His house was collateral for a loan he could never repay. His arrogant legal strategy had completely imploded. I reminded him that he had spent the last week threatening to send me to a federal penitentiary for a crime I did not commit. Now he was the one facing decades behind bars for a crime he absolutely did. The trap had not just sprung shut, it had crushed him entirely. The crushing weight of my words hung in the sterile air of the courthouse conference room. Spencer remained entirely frozen in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant executive who had confidently marched in just an hour ago. Beside him, Beatrice was clutching her chest, taking short, panicked breaths, as if the small room had suddenly run out of oxygen. But my attention shifted away from their pathetic display and locked onto the only other person at the table who truly grasped the catastrophic gravity of the situation. Mr. Thorn was a predator, but he was a highly educated, self-preserving one. He made his lucrative living navigating the gray areas of family law, aggressively extracting wealth from vulnerable spouses. However, he drew a hard, impenetrable line at federal corporate fraud. I watched the gears turning behind his cold, calculating eyes. He was rapidly processing the timeline. Jamal had just laid out $800,000 embezzled, a massive second mortgage taken out on a house that was about to be foreclosed, and most importantly, the massive legal retainer Spencer had wired to his law firm Just 3 days ago. Thorne slowly uncrossed his arms. He did not look at his client. Instead, he directed his gaze straight across the scuffed wooden table at Jamal. He kept his voice completely flat, devoid of the theatrical aggression he had used. During our initial mediation, Thorne asked Jamal to clarify the exact date. The federal authorities were officially notified of the stolen corporate funds. Jamal did not hesitate. He stated that the formal evidentiary packet had been securely transmitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. Thorne nodded slowly, absorbing the reality that the federal machine was already moving. He then asked a second much more pointed question. He asked if the $400,000 second mortgage Spencer had recently secured was obtained by leveraging his fraudulent executive income on the bank loan application. Jamal simply reached into his leather dossier and handed Thorne a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of Spencer's mortgage application, clearly highlighting the inflated, unverified income figures Spencer had used to secure the cash. The math crystallized in Thorne's mind instantly. Spencer had committed wire fraud to steal from his company, and he had committed bank fraud to get the second mortgage. Spencer had then used the proceeds of that bank fraud to pay the law firm. Thorne realized he was currently holding stolen money. Thorne stood up. He did not say a single word of comfort to Spencer. He simply reached out, grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, and snapped the brass latches open. He began sweeping his legal pads, his expensive gold pen, and his pristine printed files into the bag. With rapid, aggressive efficiency, the sharp sound of the brass latches snapping shut finally jolted Spencer out of his paralyzing shock. Spencer looked up, his eyes wide and frantic. He reached out across the table, grabbing the sleeve of Thorne's expensive pinstripe suit. He asked Thorne what he was doing. He ordered his lawyer to sit back down, loudly, reminding Thorne that he had just paid a massive $50,000 non-refundable retainer. Spencer begged him to file an injunction, to call the judge, to do whatever it took to stop this nightmare. Thorne violently yanked his arm away, treating Spencer as if he were covered in a contagious disease. He looked down at his soon-to-be former client with absolute disgust. Thorne stated clearly that there was no legal strategy on earth to stop a federal indictment that was already in motion. Spencer's voice cracked. He practically pleaded, leaning heavily on the table. He reminded Thorne about attorney-client privilege. He demanded that Thorne defend him in federal court, promising that he could somehow find more money from his friends to pay for the upcoming trial. Thorne zipped his briefcase shut and gripped the handle tightly. He leaned down, his face inches from Spencer's pale, sweating forehead. Thorne explained that attorney-client privilege completely dissolved the absolute second a client used a law firm to facilitate or hide a criminal act. He explicitly stated that the retainer Spencer had wired was the direct product of federal bank fraud. Thorne announced that he was legally obligated to report the fraudulent origin of those funds to the authorities and immediately surrender the entire retainer to the federal government. Thorne straightened his tie, his posture rigid. He told Spencer that he was a family law attorney, not a miracle worker. He declared that he would absolutely not risk his law license, his prestigious firm, or his own freedom to go down on a sinking ship with a foolish, arrogant thief. He advised Spencer to remain completely silent and immediately seek the services of a federal criminal defense attorney, though he noted sarcastically that Spencer could no longer afford one. Without a single backward glance, Thorne turned on his heel. He walked briskly across the conference room, pulled the heavy wooden door open, and stepped out into the hallway. The door clicked firmly shut behind him. Spencer was completely abandoned. The man who had boasted about his endless funds and his aggressive legal attack dog was now sitting utterly alone, stripped of his wealth, his career and his final line of defense. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, sealing Mr. Thorne's departure and leaving a suffocating vacuum. In the conference room, Spencer remained entirely frozen in his chair. His hands hovered slightly over the scuffed table, his fingers twitching, as if trying to grasp a lifeline that had just been violently ripped away. He stared blankly at the empty space where his ruthless attack dog had been sitting just seconds ago. The reality of his total isolation finally settled over him like a crushing weight. He had no lawyer, no job, no money, and the federal authorities already possessed the digital blueprints of his crimes. He was completely ruined. Beatrice, who had spent the entire morning standing proudly behind her son, like a victorious general, suddenly began to tremble. Her carefully constructed facade of aristocratic superiority completely shattered. She looked down at the glossy photograph of the $12 million acquisition contract she had so arrogantly slammed onto the table. The horrible realization finally hit her. She had stolen that document, believing it was the weapon that would destroy me. Instead, she had personally hand-delivered the evidence that proved her son was a desperate, cornered thief. Her breathing became shallow and frantic. The expensive pearl necklace she always wore to flaunt her wealth now looked like a tightening noose. She stepped away from Spencer, her designer heels clicking erratically against the linoleum floor. She moved around the wooden table, her eyes wide and overflowing with genuine, terrified tears. There was no theatrical performance this time. There was no fake sobbing, designed to manipulate a court mediator. This was the raw, pathetic panic of an arrogant woman, watching her entire legacy crumble into dust. She stopped right in front of my chair, and her knees buckled. Beatrice, the woman who had spent 5 years treating me like an unwanted, uneducated servant, collapsed onto the dirty courthouse floor, right at my feet. She grabbed the fabric of my cheap beige cardigan. With shaking hands, she looked up at me, her mascara running down her wrinkled cheeks, completely abandoning whatever pride she had left. She begged me to stop this. Her voice cracked into a high-pitched wail as she pleaded with me to call my corporate attorneys and tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding. She cried out that I had to retract the federal report and save her precious son from prison. She desperately tried to invoke the very bond she had spent years trying to destroy. She sobbed loudly, telling me that family is family. She claimed that, no matter what harsh words had been spoken in anger, we were still legally bound together, and we had to protect each other. She begged me to find it in my heart to forgive Spencer for his mistakes, frantically promising that he would pay back every single stolen cent if I just gave him a second chance. She swore that things would be different, that they would respect me, and that we could all just go back to the way things were before this horrible mess started. Spencer did not intervene. He did not tell his mother to get up off the floor. He simply sat there staring blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic implosion of his life. I did not flinch. I did not pull my cardigan away from her desperate grip. I simply looked down at her pathetic weeping form. The contrast between this moment and the past 5 years was absolute. I was the woman she had mocked for living on a measly household allowance. I was the woman she had gleefully helped lock out of her own home, and now she was kneeling before me, weeping like a child begging for her son's freedom. I slowly reached down and firmly peeled her trembling fingers off my clothing. I dropped her hands back to her sides. Refusing to let her touch me, I leaned forward slightly, making sure my voice was crystal clear. In the quiet room, I told her there was absolutely no going back. I reminded her of the dinner we shared just a week ago, the night she had sat across from me, sipping wine and smiling, while Spencer aggressively cut off my bank access and demanded my car keys. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and repeated the exact words she had thrown in my face. That night, I told her that a woman who does not earn money should know when to stay silent. Beatrice let out a sharp, devastated gasp. She completely folded in on herself, burying her face in her hands. As she sobbed uncontrollably onto the floor, she had no response. The weapon she had used to humiliate me had just been turned around and used to sever her last string of hope. Jamal quietly closed his thick leather dossiers and snapped the brass latches of his briefcases shut. He looked down at Spencer, who was still staring blankly at the wall, and formally announced that his duties, as the court-appointed forensic auditor, were officially concluded. Jamal picked up his briefcases and walked toward the exit, leaving Spencer and his weeping mother entirely alone with the wreckage they had built with their own hands. I did not wait for Beatrice to stop crying. I picked up my canvas tote bag, adjusted the sleeves of my faded beige cardigan, and walked out of the conference room. I did not look back at the wreckage I was leaving behind. I navigated the labyrinth of the courthouse hallways, took the elevator down to the main floor, and stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the city. I walked across the street to a small quiet coffee shop, ordered a hot latte, and took a seat directly by the front window. I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the courthouse parking lot. I wanted to watch the final act of this tragedy unfold with my own eyes. 15 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the courthouse pushed open. Spencer and Beatrice stumbled out onto the concrete steps. They looked like two traumatized survivors of a massive shipwreck. Beatrice was leaning heavily on her son's arm, her makeup completely smeared down her cheeks, her expensive designer clothing looking suddenly rumpled and disheveled. Spencer was deathly pale. He walked with a stiff mechanical gait, as if his brain had forgotten how to properly control his limbs. They slowly made their way down the steps and headed toward the visitor parking lot to escape. Spencer had driven them to the courthouse in the luxury sedan he had so arrogantly demanded from me. Just a couple of weeks ago, he had claimed he needed the vehicle to project the image of a powerful tech executive. But as they approached the parking space, that image was being physically dragged away. A massive heavy-duty tow truck was backed up directly to the luxury car. The mechanical winch was actively groaning, lifting the front tires of the sedan clean off the pavement. A man in a high-visibility vest was casually securing heavy steel chains around the front axle. The sight of his stolen prize being hauled away temporarily snapped Spencer out of his paralyzing shock. His grief instantly morphed back into frantic anger. He dropped his mother's arm and sprinted across the cold asphalt. He screamed at the tow truck driver, waving his arms wildly, demanding that the man drop the vehicle immediately. He yelled that there had been a massive mistake and loudly claimed he was a senior vice president who legally owned that car. The tow truck driver did not even flinch. He calmly finished tightening the thick metal chains, wiped his hands on his denim jeans, and pulled a clipboard from the cab of his truck. He looked at Spencer with absolute boredom and stated that there was no mistake at all. The driver explained that the leasing company had ordered an immediate repossession. because the monthly payments had abruptly stopped. When Spencer had arrogantly seized the car from me, he had been so consumed with stealing my supposed shell company and hiding his own massive embezzlement that he completely forgot to transfer the auto-pay settings. He had let the lease default. Spencer frantically patted down his custom-tailored suit pockets. Pulling out his leather wallet, he begged the driver to let him pay the overdue balance. Right there in cash, he pulled out multiple credit cards, offering to swipe them on the spot to stop the tow. But the driver just shook his head. He explained that the account was already in severe default status, and the vehicle had to be impounded immediately. If Spencer wanted it back, he would have to call the bank during regular business hours and pay the exorbitant penalty fees. Beatrice hobbled over to her son, clutching her chest, completely humiliated, as several pedestrians stopped on the sidewalk to watch the commotion. She begged Spencer to just call a taxi so they could go home and hide. She did not realize that the house they were going back to was already slipping through their fingers. Spencer ignored her. He continued to yell at the tow truck driver, his voice echoing off the concrete buildings, completely losing whatever shred of dignity he had left. But the repossession of the car was just the opening act. As Spencer was screaming at the impassive driver, an unmarked black SUV pulled sharply into the parking lot. It stopped abruptly, blocking the tow truck's exit path. The heavy doors of the SUV swung open simultaneously. Two men wearing tactical windbreakers stepped out. The bold yellow letters printed across their backs spelled out exactly who they were. They did not rush. They walked with absolute, terrifying purpose directly toward Spencer. The taller of the two federal agents called out Spencer's full legal name, his voice booming across the parking lot. Spencer froze mid-shout. He slowly turned around, his hands still balled into fists, the color completely drained from his face. For the second time that morning, the agent stepped up to Spencer and firmly instructed him to place his hands behind his back. He stated loudly and clearly that Spencer was being placed under federal arrest for severe corporate embezzlement, wire fraud and bank fraud. Beatrice let out a blood-curdling scream. She lunged forward, trying to grab the agent's arm, begging him to stop, screaming that her son was innocent. The second agent immediately stepped in, placing a firm hand on Beatrice's shoulder and issuing a stern warning that she would be arrested for obstructing a federal investigation if she did not step back. Spencer did not fight. He did not yell. He offered absolutely no resistance. As the cold steel handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists, he was completely broken. As the agents patted him down and guided him toward the back of the black SUV, Spencer looked up. His eyes scanned the street and locked directly onto the window of the coffee shop where I was sitting. I raised my ceramic mug, took a slow sip of my hot latte, and gave him a tiny polite nod. The doors of the SUV slammed shut. The unmarked black SUV pulled out of the parking lot, merging seamlessly into the busy downtown traffic, carrying Spencer away to a federal holding cell. His desperate screams faded, replaced by the mundane sounds of city life. I set my ceramic mug down on the small table inside the coffee shop. The performance was over, but the stage was not quite empty. Across the street, Beatrice remained on the cold asphalt. Her knees had given out. She was kneeling next to the empty parking space, where her son's luxury sedan had been repossessed just moments prior. She looked incredibly small, a shattered relic of her former arrogance. Her designer clothes were rumpled. Her perfect hair was a mess, and her illusion of power was completely gone. I paid for my coffee, pushed open the glass door of the cafe, and walked across the street. Jamal was standing near the courthouse steps, his heavy leather briefcases resting securely by his feet. He watched his mother-in-law weeping on the pavement, with a look of absolute clinical detachment. I walked up and stood silently beside him. Neither of us offered Beatrice a single word of comfort. She had spent years actively trying to destroy us, wielding her manufactured superiority like a weapon. Now she was choking on the ashes of the fire she had so eagerly stoked. Suddenly a silver sedan turned sharply into the courthouse parking lot, its tires squealing slightly against the pavement. It abruptly halted, right next to where Beatrice was kneeling. The driver's side door swung open, and Caroline stepped out. Caroline was Spencer's younger sister and Jamal's wife. Unlike Spencer, who was consumed by endless greed, or Beatrice, who was blinded by social status, Caroline had always been grounded. She wore a simple trench coat and a look of profound, rigid anger. Beatrice heard the car door and looked up. Her tear-streaked face immediately contorted into a mask of desperate relief. She scrambled to her feet, her designer heels clicking frantically on the asphalt. As she rushed toward her daughter, she threw her arms out, sobbing hysterically, crying out that federal agents had just kidnapped Spencer. She demanded that Caroline call a lawyer immediately, expecting her daughter to embrace her, to validate her panic, and to join her in attacking Jamal and me. Caroline did not open her arms. She took a deliberate step back, raising her hand to stop her mother from coming any closer. Beatrice froze, her hands hovering in the empty air, a look of profound confusion washing over her face. Caroline kept her voice steady, but the underlying fury was unmistakable. She told her mother to stop screaming. She announced that she was not there to rescue Spencer, and she was certainly not there to comfort the woman who had helped him try to ruin an innocent life. Caroline reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. She threw them onto the ground right at Beatrice's feet. It was a copy of the executive summary from Jamal's forensic audit. Caroline explicitly stated that Jamal had called her the moment he uncovered Spencer's massive corporate embezzlement. She told Beatrice that she had spent the entire morning reviewing the undeniable proof of her brother's severe crimes. She knew about the stolen $800,000. She knew about the fraudulent second mortgage Spencer had obtained. And she knew exactly what Beatrice had done. Caroline pointed a shaking finger at her mother. She confronted Beatrice about breaking into my corporate archives, stealing the acquisition contract, and attempting to blackmail me for $6 million to cover up Spencer's massive theft. Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, desperately trying to formulate a lie, to spin the narrative, like she always did, to protect her favorite child. But Caroline cut her off instantly. Caroline stated that she had spent her entire life watching Beatrice favor Spencer, constantly treating him like the golden child who could do no wrong. She reminded Beatrice of all the times she had looked down on Jamal and treated me like an uneducated burden. Caroline's voice grew painfully cold as she delivered the final blow. She declared that Beatrice and Spencer deserved each other, and they both deserved exactly the ruin that was coming to them. Caroline explicitly told her mother that she was done. She announced that she was legally cutting all ties, that she would not pay a single dime toward Spencer's criminal defense, and that Beatrice was permanently banned from her home. Beatrice let out a gut-wrenching wail, collapsing to her knees. For the third time today, she begged Caroline not to leave her crying. That family is supposed to stick together. Caroline did not look back. She walked away from her mother, crossing the asphalt with absolute certainty. She approached the courthouse steps, where Jamal and I were waiting. Caroline reached out and took her husband's hand, then turned and offered me a small, exhausted but genuine smile. I nodded back. We stood there together, an impenetrable wall of unity. Beatrice was left entirely alone, in the empty parking lot, weeping over the scattered pages of the audit, completely abandoned by the family she had tried so ruthlessly to control. A month passed since that crisp downtown morning. The gears of the federal justice system ground forward with merciless efficiency. Spencer was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting his criminal trial, without his exorbitant executive salary, and with his predatory lawyer, having rightfully surrendered the fraudulent retainer to the authorities. Spencer was assigned a completely overworked public defender. The judge had denied him bail, citing him as a severe flight risk, given his offshore accounts and complete lack of remaining domestic assets. He spent his days in a bleak, windowless concrete cell, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. It was a brutal departure from the custom-tailored suits and the opulent corner office he once believed he deserved. He was facing up to 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud, bank fraud and corporate embezzlement. Absolutely no one from his extended family, not even the uncles, who had so happily drank his beer at the weekend barbecue, answered his collect calls. He was entirely erased from their lives. Meanwhile, I instructed my legal team to finalize the paperwork, executing the foreclosure on the sprawling suburban house Spencer had officially defaulted on, the massive second mortgage. The moment the federal government froze his bank accounts, my holding company moved swiftly and without an ounce of mercy. Within 30 days, the property was legally seized by Aura Staging and Acquisitions. The locks were changed once again, but this time my corporation held the master key. The morning the eviction notice was formally served by the county sheriff, Beatrice was still living in the master bedroom, desperately clinging to the delusion that she could somehow maintain her lavish lifestyle. My private corporate security team oversaw her mandated departure. She was permitted to take only her personal clothing and whatever could physically fit into the trunk of a rented economy car. She was absolutely forbidden to take the expensive imported furniture, the fine art, or anything purchased with her son's stolen corporate funds. I watched via a live security feed as she walked down the long paved driveway, dragging 2 cheap suitcases behind her. She looked back at the massive house she used to rule, finally experiencing the exact humiliation of being tossed out onto the street that she had wished upon me, with her son locked in federal custody, and her daughter Caroline completely refusing to answer her phone calls or text messages. Beatrice had absolutely nowhere to turn. She had spent her entire adult life relying on the wealth of the men around her, lacking any financial independence, savings or practical career skills. She was ultimately forced to sign a lease on a tiny, cramped 1-bedroom apartment in a run-down industrial neighborhood, right next to the interstate highway. The living conditions were a shocking contrast to her previous luxury. The apartment walls were paper-thin, the faded carpet smelled faintly of stale smoke, and the constant, deafening roar of highway traffic completely replaced the serene quiet of the affluent suburbs. She had no guest room to host her friends, no formal dining table to display her china, and no private driveway. Her entire world had drastically shrunk down to 4 dingy walls. It was a brutal, physical manifestation of the consequences of her own malicious greed. However, the loss of her physical home was absolutely nothing compared to the complete destruction of her social standing. Beatrice had defined her entire existence by her elite status. At the exclusive regional country club, she had spent decades holding court over afternoon tea, viciously gossiping about other women, and bragging endlessly about her brilliant tech executive son. 2 weeks after moving into her miserable new apartment, Beatrice desperately tried to cling to the ghost of her old life. She put on her best remaining designer dress, carefully applied her makeup, and drove her rented car to the country club. For the prestigious monthly charity luncheon, she walked into the grand dining room, expecting the women to offer her sympathy and grace. Instead, she was met with a deafening icy silence. The massive scandal of Spencer's federal arrest and his staggering corporate embezzlement had been plastered across the front page of the local financial news. Every single wealthy woman in that room knew exactly what her son was, and more importantly, they knew Beatrice was now entirely destitute. When Beatrice forced a smile and approached her usual table, the women simply picked up their crystal glasses and physically turned their chairs away, refusing to even look her in the eye. The club manager quietly approached Beatrice from behind and politely but firmly informed her that her elite membership had been suspended due to unpaid dues. Beatrice was humiliatingly escorted out of the club through the back service doors by security, her pristine reputation irreparably destroyed forever. The smell of roasted turkey and expensive Cabernet filled the air of my downtown penthouse. It was Thanksgiving Day, exactly 1 year since Spencer demanded my car keys, and Beatrice threatened to destroy my life over a stolen photograph. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights sparkled against the cold November night. Inside my home radiated absolute warmth and genuine peace. There were no passive-aggressive comments masking deep-rooted jealousy. There were no arrogant demands or staged performances of superiority. The toxic weight that suffocated me for 5 long years was entirely gone. In the sprawling open kitchen, Jamal and Caroline were laughing out loud as they tried to properly carve the massive turkey. Caroline looked completely transformed, without the constant, overbearing shadow of her mother demanding perfection. She radiated a bright, effortless joy. She had started her own graphic design business and was finally living for herself. Jamal stood beside her pouring another glass of wine. He looked relaxed, no longer burdened by the exhausting task of navigating Spencer's endless ego and Beatrice's subtle condescension. Sitting on the velvet sofa was Riley, my fiercely loyal executive assistant. I absolutely refused to let her spend the holiday alone in her small apartment. Riley was the one who made that frantic phone call when Beatrice broke into my corporate archives. She stood by my side, managing the chaos of the empire, while I fought a war on the home front. Today she was not my employee. She was an honored guest, a vital part of the tight-knit circle I carefully chose to surround myself with. I walked over to the kitchen island, carrying a tray of warm artisan bread. Caroline looked up and smiled, bumping her shoulder affectionately against mine. We carried the platters over to the massive mahogany dining table. It was set perfectly, with fine crystal and glowing candles. It was a table set for 4, but it felt infinitely richer and more complete than the crowded, hostile family dinners I used to endure in the suburbs. We all took our seats. As Jamal poured the last of the Cabernet into our glasses, I stood up at the head of the table. I looked at the 3 incredible people sitting before me. I raised my glass, the crystal catching the warm candlelight, and asked them for a moment of their time. The room grew pleasantly quiet. I told them that for a very long time, I believed I had to endure suffering to earn my place at the table. I thought playing the role of the quiet, obedient wife was the only way to keep the peace. But peace built on a foundation of lies and extortion is just a prison in disguise. I spent 5 years building an empire in the absolute shadows, because the people who were supposed to protect me were the exact ones I needed to hide from. They mistook my silence for weakness. They mistook my patience for submission. They did not understand that when you push a woman into the dark, you only give her the perfect cover to meticulously plan her ultimate victory. I looked at Caroline, who was watching me with tears welling in her eyes, and then at Jamal, whose steady presence had been the catalyst for the final blow. I told them that the most profound lesson I learned from the wreckage of this past year was about the true definition of family. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water. We are taught that we must honor our roots, no matter how deeply diseased they have become. But I realized that sometimes you have to completely sever the toxic roots to save the rest of the tree. Family is not a biological obligation that demands your endless suffering. True family is an act of choice. It is the people who respect your boundaries, celebrate your genuine success, and stand firmly by your side. When the absolute worst storms hit, we raised our glasses together. The clear, ringing sound echoing through the beautiful penthouse. We drank to independence, to truth, and to the beautiful families we choose to build for ourselves. As I sit here today looking out over the empire I built, I can honestly say, I have never been happier or more free. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to quietly build your strength while dealing with toxic people who underestimated your worth, I want you to know that your day of victory is coming. Keep building in the shadows until you are ready to completely eclipse them. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments how you found the courage to cut toxic people out of your life. Remember, you hold the pen to your own story, so make the next chapter extraordinary. The story of Natalie's triumph over her manipulative husband and mother-in-law serves as a powerful testament to the value of quiet resilience. Often society equates loudness with power and silence with submission. However, this narrative flips that misconception entirely. The most profound lesson here is that true strength does not require constant validation or theatrical displays of dominance. While Spencer and Beatrice exhausted their energy on arrogance, insults, and desperate grabs for control, Natalie focused on meticulously building her foundation. In the shadows, she allowed her adversaries to become intoxicated by their own perceived superiority. By refusing to engage in their petty emotional warfare, she maintained her clarity and protected her assets until the perfect moment to execute her plan. Furthermore, this story highlights the crucial importance of recognizing when to sever toxic ties. Biological connections or marriage certificates do not grant anyone the right to financially or emotionally abuse you. Natalie's journey illustrates that enduring mistreatment out of a misplaced sense of duty is a profound disservice to your own potential. By walking away from the people who viewed her as a burden and choosing to surround herself with those who genuinely respected her, like Caroline, Jamal, and Riley, she redefined what family truly means. The lesson is, your self-worth is not defined by those who constantly try to diminish you, but by the quiet confidence you cultivate within yourself. You do not have to announce your every move to the world. Sometimes the most devastating response to toxicity is simply outgrowing it. and letting your undeniable success speak for itself. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your own life and dare to set the firm boundaries necessary to protect your peace and quietly build your own empire.